My husband scoffed, "You'll never make it without me," and cleaned out our joint account. But when he saw me arrive at the gala in a Rolls-Royce and heard the host announce, "Meet our wealthiest investor," he spilled his drink all over himself as I walked past with my new fiancé. I still remember the way he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a smirk, but a full-bodied, amused laugh, the kind that made his shoulders shake slightly, his eyes crinkle at the corners. It was the laugh of a man so utterly convinced of his own importance that the thought of me making it without him was downright comical. "You'll never make it without me," Bryce said, shaking his head as if the very notion was absurd. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, savoring the burn, letting the silence between us stretch out long enough for his words to sink in. I stood there, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my ears, but I refused to let him see how much it stung. How much he stung. The man I had loved for 12 years, the man I had built a life with, the man I had supported through every hardship and celebrated in every success was now looking at me as if I were nothing more than an afterthought. Like I was disposable. Like he truly, honestly believed I would crumble without him. But I didn't. And that was the mistake he made, assuming that just because I had been his for so long, I had forgotten how to be mine. Bryce and I had been married for nearly a decade. When we met, I was young, ambitious, and had a sharp mind for finance. I had dreams of making it big, of carving out a name for myself in the world of investing, of turning my knowledge into something tangible and powerful. But Bryce had always been the bigger presence, the one who commanded attention, the one who was always a step ahead. When he proposed, I was so in love that I said yes without hesitation. When he suggested I take a step back from my career to support his, I told myself it was temporary. That love meant sacrifice, that we were a team, that one day it would be my turn. Except that day never came. Bryce's career soared. He became a man people shook hands with at charity events, the one who made million-dollar deals over steak dinners, the one who was admired. And me? I became his shadow, the wife who smiled at the right moments, the woman who hosted the parties, who wore the dresses he bought, who laughed at his colleagues' jokes even when they weren't funny. I played the role so well that after a while, I almost forgot I had ever wanted anything else. Until her, Sienna Lewis. She was young, blonde, polished in the way that only women who had never had a struggle were. She wore designer dresses effortlessly, the way I used to before I started feeling like a mannequin in my own clothes. And she was exactly the kind of woman men like Bryce left their wives for when they started fearing their own mortality. I found out about her through the little things at first. A change in his cologne, the way he started leaving the house earlier, staying out later, the sudden, unexplainable interest in fitness, the extra care in his appearance. Then came the credit card charges at a luxury hotel, the lingering scent of perfume that wasn't mine, the hesitation in his voice when I asked him where he had been. I wasn't an idiot. I knew. But what gutted me wasn't just the betrayal, it was how easily he discarded me. When I confronted him, he didn't bother lying. He didn't even pretend to be sorry. He just sighed, like a man burdened by an inconvenient truth, and said, "Look, Anya, let's be adults about this." As if my heartbreak was immature. As if the vows we had exchanged were negotiable. As if the years I had spent standing beside him, behind him, beneath him, were meaningless. And then, the final blow, he emptied our joint accounts. Everything we had built, everything I had trusted him with, every dollar that should have been ours gone. Just like that. And he had the audacity to look me in the eye, whiskey glass in hand, and say, "You'll never make it without me." That was the moment something inside me snapped. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things like the dramatic women in movies. I just stopped. Stopped loving him. Stopped mourning him. Stopped believing, even for a second, that he had ever truly been my partner. And then I started again. At first, I floundered. Divorce at 39 is terrifying. You feel too old to start over, but too young to give up. I spent weeks eating takeout on the couch, watching reruns of crime shows because they were the only thing that made my problems seem small in comparison. But then something shifted. One morning, I woke up and realized I was free. Free of Bryce. Free of his expectations. Free of the version of myself that had been built around him. And I was so much more than his discarded wife. I had a degree in finance. I had a sharp mind. I had ambition that had been buried for too long beneath the weight of being his wife. So I started small, researching, learning, making connections. And then I met him. Dominic Mercer was nothing like Bryce. He listened. He saw me, not as an extension of someone else, not as a pretty accessory in a wealthy man's life, but as a woman with her own mind, her own ambitions. He was already an established investor, someone who had made his fortune by trusting his instincts. And he saw something in me, not just potential, but certainty. With his guidance, I made my first major investment, then another, and another. I built my empire from the ground up. And 2 years after Bryce walked out, I was wealthier than I had ever been. That was when I got the invitation. The same charity gala Bryce and I had attended every year of our marriage. The same one where I had once been introduced as his wife. Only this time, I wasn't going as anyone's wife. I was going as the investor of the year. And I wasn't going alone. When I stepped out of that Rolls-Royce, heads turned. I had chosen an emerald green gown, bold, striking, nothing like the safe neutrals Bryce used to prefer on me. Dominic walked beside me, his hand lightly resting on the small of my back, a silent but steady presence. Inside, I spotted him immediately. Bryce, standing at the bar, Sienna clinging to his arm. He still looked polished, still played the part of the powerful businessman. But there was something else there now, something missing in his eyes. Then the host took the stage. The room quieted as he spoke into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of our most successful investors this year, the brilliant, unstoppable Anya Collins. I walked forward, feeling Bryce's gaze burning into my back. And in the moment I would replay in my mind forever. He turned just as my name was called. His hand jerked. His drink sloshed over the rim of his glass, spilling down his suit. He looked at me, and for the first time, he was the one who felt small. I had never needed him. He had needed me. Bryce had always been good at regaining composure. Even now, with his expensive whiskey staining his overpriced suit, he tried to brush it off. He forced a tight-lipped smile, dabbing at the mess with a napkin as if this was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. But I saw the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened ever so slightly around the glass. He was rattled, and I wanted him to feel it. Not because I was bitter, no, bitterness had left me long ago, but because for years, Bryce had controlled the narrative. He had dictated the terms of our marriage, of my existence within it. He had made me believe I was small, dependent, incapable of standing on my own. And now I stood taller than he ever had. I felt Dominic shift beside me, his fingers brushing my lower back in silent reassurance. He hadn't said a word, hadn't needed to. He understood this moment without me having to explain it. He knew what it meant. Bryce wasn't supposed to matter anymore. And yet, as I looked at him, watching the forced indifference on his face, I realized something. I wasn't just here to prove him wrong. I was here to reclaim the years he had stolen from me. Sienna noticed me before he did. Her eyes flickered over my gown, my jewelry, my presents. She clung a little tighter to Bryce's arm, as if instinctively sensing that, for the first time, she was the one at risk of being overshadowed. Interesting. She had been the woman who replaced me, the woman he had chosen when I was no longer exciting enough. And yet, standing there, she didn't look victorious. She didn't look like the woman who had won the grand prize. She looked uncertain. I tilted my head slightly, offering her the same polite, distant smile that so many women had once given me when I had been Bryce's wife, the kind of smile that said, "I know something you don't." Bryce finally turned. For the first time in 2 years, our eyes met. And I saw at the flicker of recognition, the brief flash of something almost like regret before he smothered it beneath practiced arrogance. "Anya," he said, as if my name was some foreign concept he had just remembered. I gave a small nod, pretending not to notice the way his throat worked as he swallowed hard. Bryce. A single, simple acknowledgement. Nothing more, nothing less. His eyes darted to Dominic, sizing him up in the way insecure men do when faced with someone they can't immediately categorize. Dominic, to his credit, didn't so much as blink. He simply extended his hand, exuding the effortless confidence that came with real power, not the kind that needed to be constantly flaunted. Dominic Mercer. He introduced himself smoothly. Anya's fiancé. The words landed like a hammer. Fiancé. For the first time, I saw an almost imperceptible crack in Bryce's armor. His lips parted slightly, as if he had something to say, but for once in his life, he seemed to have lost his ability to fill the silence with his own self-importance. Good. Let him sit in it. Sienna shifted beside him, her grip on his arm faltering ever so slightly. Bryce, ever the master of controlling situations, recovered quickly. He forced a tight smile, nodding as if he was completely unaffected. "Well," he said, swirling the remnants of his drink. "That's unexpected." I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips. "Is it?" Bryce held my gaze a moment longer, as if trying to figure out whether he had truly underestimated me or if this was some elaborate illusion. But this was real. I was real. For the first time, he was the one standing in my shadow. And he knew it. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. This was just the beginning. Bryce's forced smirk didn't fool me. I could see the way his fingers flexed around the glass, how his tongue darted out to wet his lips tells of a man who had just taken a blow he hadn't seen coming. But he recovered quickly, the way he always had. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and let out a low, almost amused chuckle. "Fiancé," he repeated, rolling the word over his tongue like it was something unfamiliar. His gaze flicked between me and Dominic, trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't even realized existed until tonight. I knew what he was thinking. How had I moved on not just emotionally, but successfully? How had I built something for myself? created a life that was bigger and grander than the one he had so carelessly tossed me out of. Bryce had always believed that my worth was tied to him, that without his name, his influence, his money, I was nothing more than a woman past her prime with nowhere to go but down. Yet here I was, standing in front of him, flourishing. And he hated it. I smiled, the kind of effortless smile that took years to master. I guess some people do make it without you, I said lightly. His jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. Bryce never did well with being challenged, especially in public. He liked to be the one in control, the one with the upper hand. And right now, that power was slipping through his fingers. Dominic, ever the silent observer, simply slipped a hand into his pocket and glanced at me, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the type to flaunt, wasn't the kind of man who needed to prove anything to anyone, but his presence alone was enough. Sienna shifted beside Bryce, her fingers adjusting the delicate strap of her dress, as if the fabric had suddenly started suffocating her. She had been watching me the whole time, her carefully manicured nails digging slightly into Bryce's arm. She was trying to read me, trying to figure out what she had missed. What she had stolen and discarded what she thought had been hers to take was now standing in front of her, untouchable. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Well, Bryce finally said, clearing his throat, good for you. Good for me. That was the best he could come up with. It was almost laughable. The Bryce I had once known confident, smug, self-assured was struggling to string together a sentence that didn't sound like he was choking on his own pride. This wasn't a man in control. This was a man trying to pretend he didn't regret letting go of something he never thought he'd lose. Very good for me, I said, my voice as smooth as silk. Bryce opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, but before he could, the host's voice rang out again over the speakers, drawing everyone's attention. And now, ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to tonight's main event, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible success of one of our most esteemed investors. The crowd hushed. Bryce turned slightly, distracted, his brows knitting together in mild curiosity, whose contributions have not only reshaped industries, but have set new standards in investment leadership. Please give a warm round of applause for our Investor of the Year, Anya Collins. The room erupted into applause. I didn't look at Bryce as I stepped forward, didn't glance at Sienna or anyone else from my past who had doubted me. I simply walked toward the stage, the click of my heels against the polished floor echoing in my ears like a victory drum. And as I took the microphone, accepting the award with a composed smile, I finally turned back just for a second. Bryce was staring at me. His drink was back in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. His grip was too tight. His expression frozen in something that was neither admiration nor resentment, but something far more dangerous. Regret. Good. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The applause washed over me like a wave, but I wasn't thinking about the sound. I wasn't thinking about the weight of the award in my hand or the way the light reflected off the crystal edges. I wasn't even thinking about the speech I had rehearsed earlier. I was thinking about Bryce. Not in a nostalgic way, not in a yearning way, but in the way you think about an old wound, one that doesn't hurt anymore, but still leaves behind a faint, ghostly ache when the weather changes. He was still watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, boring into my back, his mind working overtime to make sense of this moment. I took my time, letting the applause settle before I leaned toward the microphone. Thank you, I said simply, my voice steady. It's an honor to be recognized for something that once felt impossible. I let that word hang in the air, impossible, because that's what Bryce had believed. He had believed that I was nothing without him, that I would never rise beyond the shadow he cast over me, that I would shrink, wither, fade into irrelevance the moment he walked away. But here I was, not just surviving, thriving. I continued my speech, keeping it professional, polished. I spoke about my investments, about risks and rewards, about the lessons I had learned along the way. The audience listened, nodding in agreement, a few murmurs of admiration carrying through the room. But the best part? The best part was Bryce. Because while everyone else saw my success as an achievement, he saw it as a reckoning. When I finally stepped down from the stage, Dominic was there, waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. He held out his hand, his fingers curling around mine, as if to say, I knew you could do this. I smiled at him, my chest swelling not just with pride, but with something deeper, something real. Dominic had never doubted me. Unlike Bryce, he had never needed me to be small so that he could feel big. He had never clipped my wings under the pretense of love. And that made all the difference. We were moving through the crowd when I felt a presence at my side, hovering too close, too familiar. I turned my head slightly. Bryce. Of course. He wasn't looking at Dominic. He wasn't even looking at me, not fully. His gaze was distant, troubled, like he was sifting through memories he hadn't meant to unearth. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but for once, Bryce Collins was at a loss for words. Interesting. I arched a brow, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a quiet chuckle. Not amused, not smug, just hollow. You always did surprise me, he murmured. I tilted my head, pretending to think. Did I? Bryce exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You know, back then, I held up a hand. Back then doesn't matter. His mouth shut. and that was the first time I had ever seen Bryce Collins at a loss. Sienna was still nearby, pretending not to watch, her expression carefully neutral, but her fingers gripping the stem of her champagne glass a little too tightly. Poor thing. I wondered if she had started to notice the cracks, yet the tiny fractures in the illusion Bryce had spun around her, the same way he had spun one around me. If she hadn't, she would soon. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Enjoy the rest of your night, Bryce. And with that, I turned. Not because I had something to prove, not because I needed to get the last word, but because I was done giving him any of my time. But as I walked away, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Bryce didn't follow me, but I felt him watching. As Dominic and I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and polite chatter from the city's elite, I knew Bryce was still standing there, absorbing everything. He had always been good at pretending he was in control. Even when he lost a business deal, even when things didn't go his way, he could fake a smile, smooth over the situation, and convince everyone that he was still the man on top. But this was different. Because for the first time, he couldn't spin the narrative in his favor. For the first time, he was the one left behind. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, laughter, and stolen glances between me and Dominic. The tension from my encounter with Bryce lingered, but it didn't shake me. If anything, it made me feel lighter. By the time the gala started winding down, I was ready to leave. Not because I was exhausted, but because I had already won. I didn't need to stay any longer. Dominic must have sensed it too because he leaned in, his voice low against my ear. Ready to go? I nodded. More than ready. He signaled for the valet, and within minutes, our Rolls-Royce was brought around. The night air was crisp, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. Just as Dominic helped me into the car, a voice cut through the noise of departing guests. Anya. I knew who it was before I even turned around. Bryce. I hesitated for only a second before I met his gaze. His tie was slightly loosened, his polished facade just a little less perfect than before. There was something different in his expression, now something that looked a lot like regret. Not the regret of losing me, necessarily, but the regret of miscalculating. The regret of realizing that the woman he had dismissed had not only survived without him, but surpassed him in every way. He took a slow step closer. Can we talk? Dominic, ever composed, simply placed a hand on the open car door, waiting. He wasn't threatened. He didn't need to be. Because this moment belonged to me. I tilted my head. About what? Bryce let out a low breath, glancing down for a brief moment before looking back at me. I underestimated you. A confession. A little too late, but a confession nonetheless. I let the words settle, let him feel the weight of them in the silence that followed. Then I smiled. A soft, knowing smile. Yes, you did. His jaw tightened just slightly, his hands slipping into his pockets, a classic Bryce move when he was trying to hide his emotions. He exhaled, searching for the right words. I held up a hand. Bryce. He stopped. I leaned slightly against the car, my expression calm, unwavering. You made your choice. And so did I. His lips pressed together. He wasn't used to this being shut down before he could finish. Bryce was used to controlling conversations, steering them in a way that suited him. But this wasn't his story anymore. It was mine. I gave him one last look, one final moment to let it all sink in. Then I stepped into the car, settling into the plush leather seat as Dominic followed. Bryce stood there, watching as the door shut, as the car pulled away, as I disappeared from his life just as easily as he had once walked out of mine. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror? Him, standing alone, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. As we drove through the city, Dominic reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. You okay? He asked, studying me. I turned to him, really looking at him, the man who had never tried to diminish me, who had never seen me as anything less than his equal. I squeezed his hand, exhaling a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. Yeah, I said, a slow smile spreading across my lips. I really am. And for the first time in years, I meant it.